下面呢，我请这个 Stephen Nage 啊，日本国际基督教大学政治与国际研究的教授啊，他在线上发言。好，现在请你发言。
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to share some ideas with all of you. And my sincere thanks to the organizers for putting on such an interesting and stimulating session. I'd like to break down my points into four, trying to address this idea of building a maritime community with a shared future. The 4 points are which maritime community for a shared future? Second, what are some potential formulas for cooperation or how to govern? Three, what are some functional areas for cooperation? And then lastly, I'd like to touch upon the idea of the role of developing states in the order building process. I think the first question is very important for us to consider. Which maritime community are we talking about? In the previous session, we had some discussions about the Arctic, the Antarctic, but we also have other maritime communities such as the Indian Ocean, the East China Sea, Sea of Japan, the South China Sea, of course, where Professor Wu is focusing on in terms of cooperation, the Pacific Islands and other areas. There is an interesting question. Do we need to be everywhere at the same time, or should we have a regional focus in terms of how we concentrate our resources to build capacity and to build public goods to create stability in our backyard or in our regional environment? In that sense, I think it's important for us to consider having a more regional focus on how we think about cooperation. And this pivots to my second idea or my second point of what formula for cooperation. Do we consider large-scale multilateral cooperation as an effective way to manage, for example, the Indian Ocean or the South China Sea or the Pacific Islands? Or do we take a mini-lateral approach where we bring in the immediate stakeholders to address some of the issues within that region? So mini-lateral approaches to cooperation generally allow for more alignment, for more shared interests with a regional focus, and often there's more shared cultural and historical understandings of a region. In this sense, it's easy to imagine Southeast Asian countries, perhaps China and Japan, to be cooperating in the South China Sea because they're such close neighbors. They have a long history of trade and engagement, and the priorities for them are and continue to be peace and stability in the sea lines of communication that go through these regions. So what are those core areas of functional cooperation that we could engage in minilateral cooperation? And again, Dr. Wu from the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam mentioned some of them, but illegal, unregulated, undocumented fishing would be a particular area of cooperation. Search and rescue, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, environmental cooperation, and of course development. All of these go hand in hand with maritime community building. And of course, when we pivot from the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea to the Pacific Islands, they all have slightly different needs. Again, speaking to the need to have a more regional approach to thinking about how we develop maritime communities. In this sense, when we pivot to this question about how developing countries can help contribute to order, in particular in the maritime environment, I think we can think about developing countries being important translators or interpreters of the regional needs. Using the example of the Pacific Islands, of course, they're faced with existential threats from climate change and the environment. Their needs are slightly different than, I think, the countries in the South China Sea or countries in the East China Sea and the Sea of Japan. And as a result, we need to listen to and speak to those Pacific Island nations to find out what their regional needs are and how can we perhaps provide some assistance to them. And here I think Professor Tu made a very good case for the importance of educational exchanges. So we build those important platforms of mutual understanding that take place in our universities and in our people-to-people exchanges. In this sense, I think a minilateral approach to dealing with maritime challenges and maritime community building will continue to be very important through consultation and listening to the regional stakeholders. And by listening to regional stakeholders, in particular those developing countries, we can get a much better sense of the challenges they face, the visions that they have, and how we can contribute. Lastly, in terms of a suggestion of how we can move forward in terms of building institutions that can bring some stability and, again, enhance maritime community building, I think there's a strong case for building a maritime cooperative initiative within different regions. And these can be an international association or a regionally focused international organization that gets resources from larger countries, whether it's China, the United States, Japan, and the EU, but it's managed by those regional stakeholders. And this avoids some of the great power political challenges that we face and allows those regional stakeholders, whether it's the Pacific Islands, the South China Sea area, in the Indian Ocean, to start to think about how they can develop regional solutions, but leverage some of the resources that can be deployed by states such as China, the United States, the EU, and Japan, who have more experience, more resources, and perhaps more capability to deal with some of the challenges that exist in terms of building maritime communities, enhancing stability, and dealing with the challenges of governing those maritime spaces. So lastly, just to reiterate, we need to define what the maritime community is. We need to discover or think about the formulas of cooperation. Is large-scale multilateralism the right formula, or should we think about regionally focused minilateralism? What are the functional areas of cooperation that we could be thinking about? And then lastly, really listening to those developing countries, understanding their needs, getting them to act as translators and interpreters for the challenges they face, and trying to establish a maritime cooperative initiative that is supported by larger, more developed countries, but managed and those resources directed by developing countries to solve their maritime community challenges that they're facing. Again, thank you very much.